So now we're into a new elevation zone that's adjacent to the desert, and it's kind of on the edge of the Sagebrush Steppe, which is a zone that connects the desert country to the foothills of the mountains. So we have a lot of sagebrush, and we have juniper, which is in the foothills where the terrain starts to rise up toward the mountains. It's called the Foothills Zone, and we'll kind of treat that along with the sagebrush zone, because here in this part of Wyoming, east of the Continental Divide, the sagebrush steppe trails right up into the foothills, and the foothills are in many places all dominated by sagebrush. So we'll combine those two different vegetation types together, foothills and sagebrush steppe, because in this area they're pretty much overlapped. So one plant that's common and very, very, very useful to the traditional seasonal gathering is a plant called squaw bush. And I guess sometimes that name is falling out of popularity, and sometimes it's called skunk bush sumac, skunk bush sumac. And skunk bush doesn't smell like a skunk. It's called that way because the smell is very strong. If you get there close to the plant, within 10 feet of it, you can smell it. And if animals have been foraging on it, elk like to eat it and deer like to eat it, you could smell it a quarter of a mile away very easily. It's a very pungent smell. It's not offensive, but it's strong. So it's related to sumac. Its Latin name is Rhus trilobata, and Rhus is the genus that sumac is in. So this plant is a berry producer, and in the spring of the year, sometimes you can find these plants that still have dried berries on them, and you can still use them, even though they're 6 months old, because the berries are produced around September, late August and September. But even the dried berries are still good. They have a lemonade flavor. Some people have come to call this bush lemonade bush, and it's because of the flavor of the berries, which are very nice orange-colored berries. The plant itself turns red in the fall, so in this picture you could see it in the fall condition. But when it's green in the summertime, it has these orange, reddish berries that stand out. And on good years, that is rainfall years that are above average, it'll be covered with berries, where one bush can give you not quite a gallon of berries if you take the time to pick them all. And they can be dried and pounded into meat as pemmican. They're very high in vitamin C and very high in bioflavonoids, which are antioxidants. Combination of vitamin C and antioxidants means that when you pound it into meat, it preserves it. This is one way to preserve meat when you didn't have refrigeration. You can carry it around with you. You can dry meat, you can smoke meat, and you can make pemmican out of it by pounding berries of different kinds into it. So most of the berries, with the exception of service berries, have a lot of vitamin C in them. And this is one of the high vitamin C berries. I have some here in a little tiny jar. These are dried out now. This is kind of the way they would look on the bush in the spring after they've already gone through the winter. And they're still going to have the lemonade flavor. So one thing you can do today is, if you're hiking along, you run into a squaw bush, lemonade bush, skunk bush, whatever you want to call it, and you see these berries, you can pick them off, crush them with a rock, and see how this does it. Well, these have been in a jar, so they've still got some water content in them, and that's really the best way to do it. Look at that. And that's a year old, and it's still got a water content to it. And that, pounded or squeezed just with your fingers and put into a water bottle, will add a nice flavor to your water bottle. It'll be kind of like lemonade. But you'll also be getting some really good nutrients. The antioxidants in there are good for your blood and cardiovascular system. They provide integrity for the interior lining of the cardiovascular system, which is called the intima layer of your arteries, which is the layer you need to keep healthy, because that's the layer that's oxidized and causes cardiovascular disease. So this is healthy for the cardiovascular system, as are other berries. But it's important to know that, as an example of the benefit of these wide variety of berries that were used by native people, is that there were stories told by the old people in the 1930s that experienced the pre-reservation life, that the people hardly ever got sick. This is pretty much true of the stories of all of these tribes in this region, that people didn't get sick except for the pathogenic diseases that came from the white man, and sometimes from animals. And some of the tribal stories we got believed, or told stories that indicated that there was a belief that the white man had all of these diseases because they lived with the animals. They lived with pigs, they lived with chickens, they lived with domestic animals, cattle, and horses, and that's where all these diseases came from. So that was a popular belief amongst the tribal elders who saw the pre-reservation life and then had to eat white man's food on the reservation. The wide variety of berries that you had to really travel in order to get, and that wasn't possible anymore after reservation life took over, were loaded with these varieties of antioxidants that we now know protect the cardiovascular system from damage of oxidation. And it's this lipid peroxidation that causes the cardiovascular system to eventually get weak and result in cholesterol buildup from lipid peroxidation and eventually heart failure. That's a gross oversimplification, but it's true that we now know that this variety of antioxidants that were in the native diet protected against that, prevented the phenomena that lead up to the cascade of events we call cardiovascular disease. And they taste good. They have a little sugary flavor in them, and they preserve things. So this is an important one because it's extremely common. It grows on hillsides, and is very common. Where you find it, it can be very common from about 6,000 feet up to about 7,000 feet. And it's drought tolerant. So I said we were in the kind of zone that innervates between the sagebrush steppe and the foothills. So let's talk about sagebrush. We could easily spend all day talking about sagebrush. It's an amazing plant in many, many ways. There are probably, I think, about 13 species of sagebrush in this area. people think of sagebrush as one thing. There's a lot of different species and variations, varieties that is, and subspecies of sagebrush. And then there's what the Shoshones call the little brother of sagebrush, which is not sagebrush, but has most of the same chemical components and a lot of the same appearance and smell. And those are herbaceous members of the genus Artemisia. So sagebrush, the common one we call big sage, and it looks like this. Everybody has seen it. It's a very medicinal plant. Shoshones call it bohovi. The leaves are medicinal, the seeds are edible, and it makes up the ground cover, the canopy in many areas in Fremont County and Sweetwater County. One of the things it does ecologically is it creates a barrier to the wind so that snow can deposit into the places between sagebrushes. And a lot of the very arid country that has sagebrush in it produces a lot of other herbaceous plants that are food plants and medicine plants, like that globe mallow we saw earlier, and some low-growing mustards, and plants that were collected for food, even sago lilies, wouldn't be growing there if it weren't for the sagebrush, because the sagebrush creates the windbreak that deposits the snow, and otherwise the snow would blow over the surface if it were just flat in the winter time. And this creates snowdrifts that can melt slowly in the spring, and that may be the only water source for some of these other plants within that ecosystem. So sagebrush is very, very important. Big sage occurs in 3 different species: Wyoming big sage, mountain big sage, and tree sage. They're very similar. The leaves have 3 lobes on the top of each leaf. And I doubt that we'll be able to see it on the video, but if you pick any individual leaf out, you can see 3 leaves, 3 lobes on the leaf. And that is characteristic of the big sages. These leaves on big sagebrush contain at least 2 compounds, a terpene and camphor, that make them mildly poisonous. So we don't take these internally except on very rare occasions for very specific medicinal treatments. For the most part, the big sagebrush leaves are used externally to treat fever. Some of the terpenes found in sagebrush leaves are volatile, and when you steam the leaves in a pot and breathe in that steam, you can reduce the fever very quickly. And that's one of the primary things it was used for, is to control fevers. They are also antimicrobial. The terpenes in sagebrush kill bacteria, and they kill fungi. So they can be used for infections, to prevent infections. The camphor in the leaves repels insects. Mothballs used to be made out of camphor. So sagebrush leaves are like little mothballs you can use to protect articles of your craft, your clothing, things you've made out of leather that you don't want bugs to get into. And they can keep rodents and bugs out of food that you've tried to preserve. So one of the things you did with branches of sagebrush in the old days before refrigeration, you bury some pine nuts that you collected. You've got way more than you need right then and there, but you want to know where it is, and you can come back to that area and collect the pine nuts months later or even a year later. But if you just buried the pine nuts in the ground, or these wild carrot roots like biscuit root, if you just buried them in the ground, insects will get in there, nematode worms will get in there, mice, voles, desert pack rats, desert wood rats, and chipmunks. All sorts of animals will find that by smell, and they'll get those pine nuts or these preserved foods. But if you line the pit with sagebrush, it'll repel all of those pests, and what we call pests, the other critters that are trying to share your food with you. Repel them in a peaceful way. It doesn't kill them, but they don't want to dig any further when they hit a lining of sagebrush in the pit. In the amongst the southern tribes, they preserved corn that way, underground or in hollows in rocks by lining it with sagebrush, so that you could come back 6 months later and you'd still have the corn there in the hole. Many uses for sagebrush and many species. So the slight variation in the chemical content of these different species allows you to use them for different purposes. So this is probably Wyoming big sage. It grows, in the rolling hills around the edges of the desert and up into the foothills, probably 2 feet tall. Mountain big sage usually grows a little bit taller, but looks very much the same. And all those leaves are used the same way. The wood can be used for starting fires. It's a very quick burning hot wood, if you need a very hot wood. For instance, to heat up rocks when you're cooking in the old way without pots, you would use a buffalo bladder or a buffalo stomach as a bag, and the water would go in there, and you would put hot rocks into that. And to heat rocks up hot enough to boil water and to cook with, you need a very hot wood as a fire. And sagebrush was used for that. Cedar wood was also used. But the big tree sage we talked about can grow 8 feet tall, way over my head. And that, in the Crow language, is called the wood we don't burn. And it has an off smell to it. It kind of smells like burning feces. And you didn't burn that in the teepee because of the smell. But these other woods, these other sagebrushes, were a good hot fire, along with greasewood and juniper, to heat up rocks. And I learned that this method of boiling water was not just a primitive way to boil water. You could actually cook certain things that you can't do in a metal pot, because if you get the rocks really hot, really dense soapstone rocks, for instance, will be hotter than boiling water. And you put the mush from acorns or from corn or pine nuts in with the water, and you stir it with this very, very hot rock in it. It does more than cook with the boiling temperature. It actually is more like cooking in an oven at a very high temperature. Boiling water's never any hotter than 212 degrees. Then at high elevations, it's less than that. But if you have a hot rock you're stirring around in there, it's kind of like baking and boiling at the same time, which can give you some of the traditional flavors that you can't get with a pot. So sagebrush wood was used for that. And sagebrush leaves were inhaled to treat any kind of a sickness where you had a fever. It lowers the fever, but it also opens up the bronchioles. It's a bronchodilator. And bronchodilators open the bronchial tubes into your lungs, so if you're congested, you can breathe easier. So it works in treating those kinds of illnesses in at least 2 ways. Plus, it kills microorganisms. So if you have a bacterial infection in your lungs, as in pneumonia, most forms of pneumonia are bacteria, you can help suppress the growth of those organisms. So it was very useful that way. If you go to other species of Artemisia, this is Artemisia tridentata, which refers to the three lobes on the leaf of these big sagebrushes. Tridentata means three-toothed. If we go to some of the other species of Artemisia, they still have the color of sagebrush and the smell of sagebrush. But fringed sage is called a little brother of sagebrush. And it's chemically a bit different, even though it has some similarities and smell similarities. It doesn't have the camphor content, and it's lower in some of the offensive terpenes, but it has just as much of a lactone glycoside called artemisinin, and that kills parasites. Well, this can be taken internally because it doesn't have the very bitter, offensive chemicals that can make you sick, like sagebrush does. So this can be made into a tea and taken internally for all manner of parasites. It's very effective on the Campylobacter types, the Shigella food poisoning bacteria, and even Giardia. So this can be used against Giardia. Malaria was once very common in the United States, and all of the Indians knew about these different sage worts. They're called sage worts. W-O-R-T, wort is an old word for an herb. I think in Scottish or English, I'm not sure, but sageworts are the little non-woody, mostly herbaceous, mostly deciduous sagebrushes. So they're all in the genus Artemisia, which includes sagebrushes and sageworts, except the sageworts can be taken internally. And that's why they're used for parasites, for food poisoning, for Giardia, and also to inhale, because they still have those properties of sagebrush that are bronchodilators that allow your lungs to breathe easier. They still can reduce the fever. The big sagebrushes are usually used to reduce the fever because they're a little more potent in that way, rather than the little brother of sagebrush. This is fringed sage, Artemisia frigida, because the leaves are fringy. They look like a little fringe. I don't know if that's visible, but it's hard to see on a dried specimen like this. But this can be made into a tea, or these days you can take it as a tincture by soaking it in alcohol. This is fringed sage tincture. It's made from this plant, soaked in 70% alcohol. And once it soaks for a couple of months, you can dilute it half with water so that it's something you can take with an eyedropper, small amount at a time. And it's good when you have something like pneumonia or an infectious disease and you want to control the bacterial levels. It is not that bad tasting. I wouldn't call it pleasant, but it's not offensive the way big sagebrush would be. If you go to Africa today or Asia and you're required to take an anti-malarial drug, what you're taking is the lactone glycoside that is in this sagebrush called artemisinin. in the drug form, which means it's just synthesized into a synthetic chemical that's a mimic of the artemisinin that's in here in the tincture. Or you could roll up the leaves of the sagebrush when it's fresh, the fringed sage, and just take it directly off the plant. And it does the same thing. It is the cure and treatment for malaria. So it not only treats malaria, but it prevents it. So when you go traveling into countries where malaria is prevalent, you're actually taking a synthesized version of fringed sage. One that grows all the way across the continent is this one, which I mentioned in the beginning as white sage. It's Artemisia ludoviciana. Grows 1 to 2 feet tall. Has broader leaves that are entire. There's no teeth on the end, so it's not a tridentata. It is an entire lanceolate leaf. And you can chew on those leaves if you think you've eaten questionable food or drunk water that is from an uncertain source. In other words, you're not supposed to drink downstream of a dead cow. There's all sorts of bacteria in water these days that can be treated with the terpenes and the lactone glycosides that are in this white sage or sacred sage. Of course, that was known in the old days as a common treatment. It was carried around in a pouch just for the symptoms of intestinal distress, which can come from eating anything, really. It might have the right bacteria on it. It's also soothing to the stomach lining so that you can, the intestines. So it's treatment for overeating or for the symptoms of intestinal distress, aside from killing the microorganisms that you want to kill. So it's a very useful plant in any stage of its growth, even when it's dried. But the ceremonial use of this plant is legendary. It's used all over the continent in tribes from California to the East Coast. And it's smudged, usually. So this is a smudge stick. And the form of the plant that's used for ceremonial purposes is the plant at its tallest growth stage before it flowers. And once it starts to develop flower heads on the top, which are little round balls that start to appear near the top of the plant, then it's no longer collected for ceremonial purposes. But it's still used as microbial, an antimicrobial medicine. So the hidatsas even have hidatsas have 2 names for this white sage in the Dakotas. They translate as nothing on top and something on top. And all that refers to is the 2 uses of this plant. You never use it for ceremonial purposes after it gets something on top, which is the flower head. So when it's immature, we call that in botanical terms, immature meaning it doesn't have any flower parts yet. It's used ceremonially for purification. You can light the end of it and the smoke will be directed onto you with a feather or your hands or onto other people before important functions or before ceremonial activities as a purification. And we can talk a little more about that later, but it's just to point out that there are different uses for the artemisias, which are called the sagebrushes, depending on their growth form. But they're all extremely medicinal. I've been told that the name for the big sagebrush is bohovie, and the meaning of that has been lost in Shoshone language, except that it derives from a word that has to do with doctor. So it'd be like a doctor plant, which is an important name for a medicinal plant to be called that. So these are smudge sticks wrapped like that, and you light the end, and you can have it burn for a long time. That's one thing these do, is they will smolder for a long time, and that smoke is very important for ceremonies and for purification. Sagebrush is also incredibly important for pronghorn antelope. Pronghorn were used for meat by Shoshones, as well as their hides were superior hide for certain types of clothing that were made for like wedding dresses and wrapping things where you wanted a very flexible yet tough leather. And tanned in just the right way, it turned out to be a very pretty, dense, kind of a dense hide that was flexible and soft. So that's why it was used for wedding dresses, and it could tan out white. So the hides were highly valued. The crows, from interviews we've done, indicated they didn't like the meat of the antelope, but they still hunted them for the hide because it was a very special and different kind of hide. But sagebrush steppe is where antelope live. They do well eating sagebrush. In some places, sagebrush makes well over 50% of their diet, whereas most other animals don't like to eat sagebrush. Elk basically don't eat sagebrush, except the females do, just before they give birth. There's work done by Lauren Ward, who is a habitat biologist for the Forest Service, who identified some essential oils that cow elk require in order to have calves successfully. And they could smell that oil and target those sagebrushes to eat. So elk actually do really well, or wapiti, do really well in sagebrush country. They've been eradicated from the sagebrush country for the most part due to market hunting in the 1800s, which is why the Wyoming Game and Fish Department was created initially in the 1890s, was to put a stop to the hunting of elk before they went extinct. There was danger of them going extinct in the 1800s because people like to eat elk, and the gold fields here in Atlantic City and South Pass in the middle of Shoshone Reservation in the 1860s drew in a lot of people. Most of them didn't make much money off of gold, but they all had to eat every day, and the market hunters did a really good job of making money off of exterminating the elk. So if it wasn't for extreme measures by the Game and Fish Department in Wyoming, the elk might have actually gone extinct. But by 1898, it was illegal to hunt elk in Wyoming until the 1940s. But they, like sagebrush country, the plants that grow there are really good for elk diet, even though we associate elk with the mountains now. One of the plants that elk and antelope and deer like to eat is bitterbrush, which grows in a kind of a commensal relationship with sagebrush. That is, it benefits from the sagebrush, but at the same time it's killed off by sagebrush. But it's not really killed. Sagebrush, if it's allowed to grow without a fire to burn it off, will eventually grow over the top of Bitterbrush, and the Bitterbrush top will die away, but the roots don't die. And Bitterbrush being one of the most important winter forage plants for large game animals in this whole region, it requires fire. It requires that sagebrush be burned off periodically, and that stimulates bitterbrush growth. The Indians, of course, knew that, and they would go to places after a fire and find that all of the winter ranges were concentrated where that fire was, because bitterbrush would become the dominant ground cover. It's a plant that looks a lot like sagebrush, but it's darker green. And I have a little bit of it here. This is what bitterbrush looks like right now. This is middle of April, so it hasn't gotten its leaves on it yet. But it's a tender plant, and animals love to eat these tender tips of the new growth. So they will focus on those parts. And you can tell a plant that's been heavily browsed by animals, a branch will come up and then it stops, and a side branch comes out, and it comes up, and then it gets bitten off and it grows out the side. And it causes a very haphazard look to the growth form of the plant. And that happens a lot where you have a lot of animals wintering where this grows. It's mainly a wintertime food, but all of these animals eat it in the fall and in the spring. And it was critical to know where these bitterbrush forests were to go hunting, to find meat. We don't eat it. It's very bitter. It's mildly toxic. It'll cause you to regurgitate. And certain medicinal procedures used by tribes in the old days used regurgitation as a way to get things out of the body, to remove the bad effects of something that we would call an illness. So this plant was used to treat lightning strikes where people were incapacitated with neurological problems, memory loss. Sometimes you're hit by lightning and you lose control of an arm or a leg from nerve damage. So bitterbrush was used as a treatment for that in a tea that you would drink, and it would cause you to regurgitate everything in your stomach. And it was a form of internal purification. We don't use that method today. It does not mean that it didn't work. All it means is we don't know about it. It might have been a successful treatment for those kinds of injuries. The bitterbrush seed pod, there's a seed that's produced after these flowers come out. Flowers come out in the spring, and they're beautiful yellow flowers that are very sweet smelling. And the foothills, when these plants come out and bloom, will have a really distinctive sweet odor in the air. There'll be hundreds and hundreds of flowers on each plant. But when those flowers go to seed, the little pod that comes out is full of a purple liquid. If you squeeze that, it'll turn your fingers purple. And that was a purple dye that was used on baskets and on leather, and it was painted with as a very intense purple color. That is Persia tridentata. It's in the rose family, not at all related to sagebrush, which is in the sunflower or Asteraceae family. Now here's one of the grains that was harvested and made into bread. It's usually not just this grain that was made into bread, but Indian ricegrass is this grass, produced a tiny grain that's round, And that was added to things like the biscuit root flower after it was ground up, or pine nuts. Often these different flours that were made into bread or biscuits were mixed. They weren't just one thing. It's what happened to be around what produced well that year. So in most years, this drought-tolerant grass, Indian ricegrass, was a fairly reliable crop of grain. And I have one here, right here. This can grow 3 or 4 feet tall sometimes, but most of the time, depending on the habitat and the variety, there's many, many varieties of Indian ricegrass. They're about 2 feet tall. They'll produce thousands of grains on one bunch. This is a bunch grass, so it's called a bunch of Indian ricegrass. Bunch grasses grow with many stems out of one central root. And this one will be a bunch here, and 2 feet over here, another bunch. And on the edges of sand dunes, this is a very prolific producer of good protein because of these grains. People use this as an ornamental plant in a vase because it is kind of a frilly, nice-looking plant. The Indians and the fur trappers in the 1830s would use these plants as a fire starter. You could take these stems when they're good and dry without any green parts. There's still a few little green stems in here, but you don't want that. When they're totally dry from the previous year, they're still standing. You can take them and wad them up like this into a tight wad, put it in a waterproof bag, a leather pouch that's been treated with pine pitch or leather that had been suspended over a pitch fire, where you've got lighter knots, they used to call them. They were pieces of wood with a lot of pitch attached to them, and let that black smoke permeate the leather. It makes it waterproof. And you'd carry things that you needed to be waterproof in that pouch. And ricegrass like this is kind of like gasoline. You strike a spark into this with a little bit of char cloth to hold the spark, and it'll burst into flame. So it was a fire starter in days when you started fires with a spark from hitting a rock against another rock or a steel. And this place has a smoke alarm in it, so I'm not going to show you how to light one of those fires, but if we were outside, we could do it in a matter of seconds, have a fire going, throw that into some kindling wood, and you've got quick fire. So this is this is well, they've changed the name on this ricegrass. Oryzopsis hymenoides is the name I learned for it, and it's still that way in some of the books. The new DNA typing has put a new name on it, and I can't remember what it is. But you'll find it in a lot of these old books that I have as Oryzopsis hymenoides. So this looks familiar. It's another Indian paintbrush. What's called Indian paintbrush, I think it's more correct to call them all paintbrushes since there's so many of them. Indian paintbrush is the state flower of Wyoming, but it's amongst a lot of look-alike sage paintbrushes. So unless you're a botanist, it's hard to determine which one is the Indian paintbrush. That is the state flower. And of course, I have to say, it's illegal to pick the state flower. But since there's 59 other relatives of this paintbrush that look very much like it, you're probably pretty safe gathering it for food. When they're in high bloom and very deep red or yellow colored, they actually are sweet. The tops of the plants taste a little sweet from the nectar in the flowers. So they're a resident of the Sagebrush steppe and the Foothills area, used just the same as the desert varieties. But the unique one is the yellow paintbrush, Castanea lutea, I believe it is. It's got a yellow top on it. There's several that have yellowish tops. But this one tastes like mushrooms when you fry it up. So you could fry it in a dish with other foods and add a really nice mushroom flavor to it. And even cooked, they're still very high in the carotenoid antioxidants, vitamin C, and selenium, an essential nutrient. So here's Fringed Sage, which we showed earlier, growing in its natural habitat. That's this one. This is a dried out specimen. But if you look closely at this, you could see the fringe-like leaves that are very aromatic. You can rub these on your hands, and it's actually a great way to disinfect your hands if you're worried about coronavirus. It'll kill just about everything topically. It's a good way to prevent infection if you know you're going to be poked by a lot of cactus needles while you're trying to gather food. Also a great thing to have around if you're collecting buffalo berries and hawthorn berries, which have very, very sharp spines on those bushes. They'll poke you. There's no way you can collect those berries without poking your hands with little blood spots. So this is a good plant to use to keep infection from getting into those spots. And that's the way it was used. This is the white sage we talked about. It loves the foothills. Grows up to about 8,000 feet. But it could start growing much lower than that. It'll be growing at 3,000 to 4,000 feet too in eastern Wyoming. So it does not have a strict elevation limit. It grows out in the grasslands, the shortgrass prairie of eastern Wyoming, and into the Dakotas, where the Lakota people use this also as a smudge plant and a sacred plant for purification. The gumweed also grows in this same zone, it's foothills. Very common along roadsides, so people think it's an introduced weed, and the county here spends a lot of money every year spraying it so it won't grow there. It's actually a native plant, even though it's called gumweed. And it's called gumweed because it has a gummy resin that is the white part. If you look at the flower heads on this picture, you'll see some of the flowers that haven't opened yet have a white disc on the top, and that is resin that's a lot like pine pitch, only it's more, it's less viscous. So if you stick your finger on it, it will stick to it, but you could pull it away and it's kind of like a thick syrup. That is very medicinal. It's used for many things. It's an emollient, it's soothing to the skin. It is a mild anodyne, which means a pain reliever. So you could put that right on to mosquito bites, and it takes away the itch. You could put it right on bee stings, especially if you mix it with tobacco, because tobacco neutralizes the formic acid in bee and wasp stings, and this takes away the inflammation. So it's an anti-inflammatory flower that was used for a lot of things. I suppose it was very popular mostly in modern times for treating poison ivy. If you have a severe reaction to poison ivy, get skin rashes and interminable itching, and you could stop the itching and stop the rash from progressing using a water decoction of these flowers, which are just coated with the resin. You can also inhibit the growth of skin tags and warts with that resin. Skin tags and warts are thought by some to be related to viral infections that deform the skin a bit. So this is an antiviral herb. It doesn't seem to work on all viruses, but it seems to be very effective at treating herpes viruses, all of the herpes type viruses. So herpes simplex 1 and simplex 2 and herpes zoster, shingles can be treated with tea of the leaves of gumweed. You could use the flowers too, and it's thought, and it's not really been well documented, but it's thought that the active principle is a selenium chelate that's concentrated in the upper parts of the plant. And the reason that's thought to be the case is that the studies done on herpes viruses indicates that you never lose them. You can't kill the virus. But the reason it causes inflammation and lesions, where the skin actually opens up and oozes and is very painful, is because the virus blooms and escapes from the cell membranes where it's hiding and starts to invade the rest of the tissues around it, looking for selenium, which it requires. Herpes viruses require selenium as a nutrient, and if they don't get enough, they will overpopulate and invade new territory looking for selenium. So the treatment for it is to feed it. And that's how this herb works on viruses. It doesn't kill the virus, it feeds it so that it's happy. And lots of experiments have been done with it to show that it's more effective as a preventive for things like shingles or sores, canker sores, mouth sores that are herpes related. If you know you get those, you know that they show up right after you've been under some heavy stress. The stress of starvation, for instance, but also psychological stresses like having to take a final exam or a divorce. Something very stressful can cause you to go into a selenium deficient state, which is common. Selenium is used up under high stress times, and you can only replenish it through the food source. It's not produced by your body, and many of our foods today are selenium deficient because of the type of high yield agriculture we have. Selenium's not added back into the soil, so that when you harvest vegetables like lettuce and cabbage and the common vegetable foods we have, they're all selenium deficient, except grown in new fields or places that have recently flooded along riparian zones. So the wild plants that the Shoshones would have eaten in this area have lots of selenium in it. Herpes viruses probably would not have gotten started under that theory in a diet that had a lot of selenium. But treatment for selenium deficiency is gumweed drunk as a tea in very small quantities, because this plant concentrates selenium 500 times the soil concentration. So if you're in a place like Badwater, which is named Badwater because of the high selenium concentration makes the water toxic, and the well water is toxic in Lysite and places built on the Badwater drainage, you don't want to use much gumweed as a treatment. Probably wouldn't need it at all if you live there. it can be toxic. So this is a toxic plant that's medicinal. One of the things it was used for, according to one expedition account, was the Shoshones claimed to use it to make them strong. And that makes total sense, because without selenium in your diet, you cannot build muscle. Muscle tone is 100% dependent upon selenium in the diet. If you have no selenium in your diet, it's called muscular dystrophy, technically. And muscular dystrophy can occur in a nutritional form. In veterinary medicine, it's called nutritional muscular dystrophy, or NMD. And it's treated with plants that have a lot of selenium in them. So if you run low on selenium, you can't build muscles. In the old days, Shoshone runners were famous before the horse for getting messages from one village to another, hundreds of miles apart. And runners drank this tea to keep their muscle tone at peak performance. So I drink it, not only at times of stress, but several times a year I make a point of drinking gumweed tea just to supplement. There's no need to buy selenium supplements when you can drink a tea like this, which is more natural. It's in a chelated form. The root of selenium, the root of gumweed was in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. U.S. Pharmacopoeia is the book of accepted drugs in the United States. It was in there until the late 60s, and of course there was a period of time from 1935 to the 70s where there was a concerted effort to get rid of all natural sources of drugs and go completely over to synthetics. That was a rationale that still holds today, partly because there's a longer shelf life to the synthetics, but also, and more importantly, you can't patent natural products in the United States, but you can patent synthetic drugs. So synthetic versions of all these Native American medicines that were in the plant form are available now. Most people don't know they're Native American medicines. But that was a process that was used. The gumweed roots were in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia as a treatment for pneumonia, because those roots, most of the selenium is produced on the root hairs and it goes up into the top plant. But the root itself, once the plant is mature, doesn't have that much selenium in it to make it toxic, but it's a bronchodilator, so it opens up the lungs, and it's also an antimicrobial herb, so that it's good at fighting pneumonia and allowing the patient to breathe. It was very effective until it was replaced by synthetic drugs around 1969. So there's very different uses for this one particular plant. It's anti-inflammatory for the venoms of bee stings, wasp stings, red velvet ants, which are one of the most poisonous critters we have. And I didn't mention scorpion stings. It's also used for that. But it's also a selenium supplement for viral infections of a certain class, and a bronchodilator for pneumonia and lung congestions, including allergies. I might add two other things that are things I've learned from tribal authorities that know these plants. Curtis Barney called this plant ghost plant, and he said it was used in a very special way. You had to say the right words, know the right rituals. But the plant dried was lit so that it smoldered kind of like a smudge stick. And a house that was thought to have bad spirits in it or ghosts that were lingering around that bothered people, you could go through the house and smoke the whole house with this burning gumweed. and then leave for a while, and the ghosts would go away, and you could come back into it, or the spirits. The other use I know of where a lot of these plants were used is in the Crow tradition. If you look at photographs of the pre-reservation Crow warriors and men in the Crow tribe, they were famous for hairstyles where the pompadour was raised up in front of their head like a big shield. And in order to hold that hair in place, they used the resin from the flowers of gumweed to stiffen up the hair. So those are a couple of other uses. I know that you could make a glue out of the gum and gumweed, mixing it with other things, and I'm not absolutely sure the proportions and how to do that, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But it could be made into a glue for gluing things together. So another common plant that has weed in its name incorrectly is milkweed. Milkweed had a number of diverse uses, very different applications of the same plant. This is showy milkweed or common milkweed. There's several species. This one happens to be edible, and it's a choice collectible food that tastes wonderful. If you like asparagus, it tastes exactly like asparagus. If you collect it in the early spring when it's just coming out of the ground, it'll be 6 to 8 inches tall. You could still use it when it's taller than that. But that's the prime time to get it, before the leaves really mature. And while it's still in the early spring growth stage, it is full of a white latex. The sap in these herbaceous plants that oozes out and is white is referred to as latex. That's a common botanical name for it. That sap is medicinal, but it's a very potent medicine, so much so that it's poisonous if you eat it. So the common way to prepare showy milkweed is to cut off those stems as they come out of the ground, maybe somewhere between 3 inches and 8 inches tall. Slice them into sections that'll fit in a pot, and boil it for about 15 minutes. Then you throw all of that water out, and you put new water in the pot and boil it a second time for another 15 minutes. And then you throw out that water and put it in a third pot of boiling water, and that's the final boiling for another 5 minutes or so. And then what you have is something that's the exact texture and flavor of asparagus, very loaded with B vitamins and vitamin C. So it's a great food, as common as milkweed is in damp, marshy areas. It's a very good, reliable vegetable. Today we don't want to collect it in a lot of those wet places, because sometimes those drain off agricultural fields where you have things like 2,4-D and dicamba and glyphosate, Roundup, all sorts of chemicals that make it down into those low wet places, and these plants absorb those chemicals. So you've got to find a pristine meadow that hasn't been sprayed or is not at the outlet for a drainage from a farm field that's been sprayed. And then you have a really good food source that's tasty and nutritious. The white latex had another function. There's a chemical in that latex called wabane, which is very toxic. It's the part you want to get rid of by boiling when you cook it. But wabane is a cardiac glycoside, which means it affects the heart. It's a sugar-based molecule that once it gets into the blood will affect the heart. The way this cardiac glycoside works is very much like digitalis. It's a little different, but it does the same thing. It slows down the heart rate, and that's why it's poisonous. In the correct dosage, it'll slow down the heart rate to where it stops, which is not what you want to do. It's a medicine. You want to slow it down, but increase the amplitude of the heart pulse. Slowing down the heart is known to let the heart recuperate faster after injury, after a heart attack, after a myocardial infarction where you've damaged your heart, or during extreme dehydration. You can digest your heart muscle and it's damaged for years. And the way to recuperate from that is to slow down the heart rate and let it slowly rebuild the muscle tissue, which includes the coronary arteries and the tiny capillaries that feed the heart. That all takes time because the heart never stops moving. It's a muscle that never stops. So it's unusual in that sense. And in order to repair a heart, cardiac glycosides are used. But they increase the amplitude so that your blood pressure actually goes up while the pulse goes down. And that's why poison arrows were made with milkweed latex. Because if you shoot an animal with an arrow that's been coated with milkweed milk, latex, it's also called milk. Even if it's dried onto the arrow point, if it gets into the bloodstream, it causes the heart to increase the amplitude, and then if the animal runs, which it's going to do when it's shot with an arrow, and it's got this stuff circulating through its blood and into the heart very rapidly, it basically causes the blood pressure to go up so high that it kills the animal. So poison arrows were used for hunting. Very rarely in war, but they were occasionally used in battle. So milkweed has got those two uses, three uses there. So it's a food. The latex is used as a cardiac glycoside, as medicine, and it's used as a poison arrow material. There is another use, and that is that latex also contains a proteolytic enzyme. That means there is a protein, enzymes are proteins, in that sap, in that latex, that breaks proteins apart. So when you get a lot of that sap, and it just pours out of the stem when you cut it, you can run it over a piece of meat that's very tough and pound it in there. You make sure you permeate it. You can stick it with a knife or a stick to get it inside of the meat. And it's a meat tenderizer because it pre-digests the protein. So this could be used for old people who don't have teeth anymore to tenderize meat. And it was used that way. Once it breaks down the protein in the meat, it also denatures the wabane so that it's no longer a poisonous compound. It's used to digest proteins where you have an abnormal growth on the skin. So this latex is famously used to remove warts and as part of the mixture of plants for treating skin cancers. So you don't want to use this all by itself on a skin cancer because it may cause it to actually spread by breaking down the protein around the tumor itself. And that's why you always use it with other plants like creosote bush or the bark of chokecherry trees, or the chokecherries themselves actually prevent tumor growth if you use the seeds. So one of the interesting things I discovered on an expedition in Ethiopia is that there's a tree called elephant tree. In my job, I was a plant collector, so I had to identify these tropical plants. And this tree, elephant tree, has these beautiful pink and white flowers that reminded me a lot of milkweed flowers. And I didn't know what it was because I was not a tropical botanist, but I was working for a tropical botanist. And I wanted to see if it was a milkweed based on the flowers and the fact that it had a few seed pods. It looked like milkweed seed pods. So I broke a branch and this white latex came out. And I put it on a birthmark I had on my belly. And I just dabbed it on there until it coated it like paint. And I was just about ready to go back to camp anyway, which is a few miles away, and bring my load of plants in. And I told the botanist when I got there, I think I know what this is. I think it is in the milkweed group because the birthmark I had on my belly was falling off and I could just pull it out. And that proved it had a proteolytic enzyme that was digesting my skin right there. So guess what? The people there make poison arrows out of this same plant for the same reasons. And it's the wabane. Wabane is the pharmaceutical name now that it's synthesized for this cardiac glycoside, but it comes from the Somali word for poison arrow, wabane. So this is another plant that here is growing in Ethiopia, but it's been imported to Ethiopia from America because this plant is indigenous to the Americas. And that's the only photograph I have of one right now, I believe. Yeah. And it's called Amaranth. And I don't have a specimen here. In the summertime I have live amaranth because I grow it in my garden. And amaranth is an amazing food that would have been fairly common in the old days. It's now considered a roadside weed called pigweed. And it's sprayed out of existence for the most part. You could still find it growing in the mouths of canyons here and there. When the plant is young, the leaves are kind of like spinach. Spinach is a relative of this, and it's like garden. What do they call it? Well, there's garden amaranth, and there's a pigweed that's edible that people grow in their gardens because it tastes like spinach. So that was a pot herb, a salad green, and the seeds are an amazing seed that we could pop if we could get over to a stove. I don't have a stove here. But it pops like popcorn and smells wonderful. It's a very high protein, something like 15% protein in a grain that also has carbohydrates and a good type of fatty acid in it. So it's almost a perfect food. It's pretty close to a complete protein in the grain, the seed. This is some of the grain amaranth. Here it's a very tiny grain, a lot like Ethiopian teff. And plants will produce a lot of this grain, which is easy to process. You can grind it into a flour and mix it with the wild carrot flowers like biscuit root or yampa. And it makes a high protein addition to bread. Now, this is the thing about Indian bread. In the old days, it wasn't like our bread today, which is for the most part carbohydrate. Well, the wild biscuit root part of it is a carbohydrate, but when you add grains like these pigweed grains to it, it becomes a high protein bread also. So bread could be an entire meal when you have amaranth as a part of the flour, because it has protein, it has fatty acids, and it has carbohydrate. This at one time was very common. It's still common in the Southwest where the plants grow bigger, in canyons where they're not sprayed out of existence by weed and pest control people. It is still a large plant that produces a lot of grain, and all of the tribes of the Southwest going right down into Peru use this as a staple grain. So some of the ethnobotanical stuff I've read indicates that at one time this would have grown into Wyoming and Montana and probably been used quite a lot, even though it's a smaller plant up here and doesn't produce as much grain. And the grains produced here, this is a Mexican variety of amaranth. The one that grows here has dark seeds, actually red seeds. But otherwise they pop just the same and they're just as nutritious. So maybe later I can get a stove and pop some of that. So now we're ready to pop the amaranth. We've got some butter here, we've got some amaranth right here, and we're preheating this pot, this pan. So what we're going to do is take a little bit of butter, we'll put it in this cup. And this is salted butter, so we don't need to add any salt. Actually, I eat it often without any butter either, but it's much tastier to most people's palate if you have a little butter and salt. So, we preheat this pan. Whoop, might have got it too hot. Turn it down. Not used to using an electric stove. So we take the lid off temporarily and we do a test. So we'll do this test, the jiggle test I call it. You put a few of the grains in there and see if they jiggle, and they are jiggling. Still sticking a little bit. So that means it's hot enough. And that means we can pour the amaranth in. Not too much, you want just a little layer, and watch them jiggle and pop. There it goes, you can see it popping. You gotta be fast. The more you shake it, the more they'll pop. Well, we got a lot of them to pop that time. The butter's already in this cup, and we pour the hot amaranth on top of the butter, and that'll melt it. Because it has a fairly high oil content in these grains, so that keeps the heat in the grain to melt the butter. And let that sit for a little bit, and we can stir it. Since this butter is already salted, we don't have to add anything like salt to it, but I like to add a little cardamom to it, sometimes as a spice, but in the traditional way, you wouldn't add cardamom, you would add something like bee balm leaves and bee balm flowers, which are actually hot, like hot peppers. And hot peppers are great in amaranth. So bee balm flowers would be the thing they would add here in Wyoming, which is the equivalent of hot peppers at this latitude. Okay, so there it is. That's what it looks like. Now you can do a lot of things with this. I like to eat it just like it is as a breakfast, kind of a gruel, but it doesn't have a lot of moisture to it other than the butter. It's still nice and hot. So it's like a hot breakfast. Perfectly salted, And it's just got its own unique, rich flavor. It's not like popcorn as much as like a real rich grain flavor. That's all there is to it. Now, the other thing you can do with amaranth is add these already popped grains to other things like biscuit dough and make bread with it with the popped amaranth already in the dough that you're going to bake. And it adds a crunch to biscuits. Plus, it adds a lot of protein to it. And this is a traditional Mexican dessert or candy, depending on when you serve it and to whom. But it's something made for kids these days. But I think traditionally, popped amaranth brittle is made by cracking honey. This is made with honey. I think in the old days, this was a Native American sweet dessert, and it would have been made with agave syrup in the South. And here, if they made it here, there's a good chance they did, according to some of the ethnobotanical studies. They probably would have used maple syrup that had been cracked. That is, you heat it up and you cool it down and you heat it up again to a high temperature. When it bubbles, you let it cool down and it forms this hard candy. And that's what you eat. This is a delicious dessert treat. It's not only sweet, but it's high protein and very flavorful as a grain. So this is an interesting plant that we call puccoon, which is an Indian name. I'm not sure what tribe. It's an eastern tribe, a Cree name, I believe. But puccoon is just the name of the plant. And we call it puccoon sometimes in the books. It's also called stoneseed. The Latin name is Lithospermum ruderale. Lithospermum means stoneseed. It means stone, and spermum means seed. Stoneseed is named because at the base of each flower is a calyx, and when it's fertilized, it'll produce a seed that's in this little capsule that looks shiny and it looks hard, and they make jewelry out of it. There were necklaces and bracelets that the Indians made out of these seeds because they were so pretty, with finally poking a hole through it with an awl, very tiny awl, and lacing it onto a string, sinew. Made beautiful jewelry. That's how the name came about. It's a plant that could be edible, but women didn't eat it particularly at certain times because it was also used as a contraceptive. This was the plant that the Crows depended on because in their tribal history and tradition, in the old days, we're told through stories that the Crows believed they shouldn't have more than one biological offspring per couple. So they would have one child. They could adopt as many as they wanted to. But they practiced contraception, and this is the plant that you do it with. It actually was studied in the 1940s and approved by the Food and Drug Administration as a safe and effective contraceptive. But in the 1940s, we were not yet using contraceptives in the Western cultures. So it was not used at that time, even though it was tested and found to be safe and effective. And the way it works is there's a chemical in the leaves and the flowers and the roots and the stems called polyphenolic acid, which is a mimic of an enzyme. it travels through the blood and it blocks the pituitary gland from producing FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, both of which are essential for implantation. So once the egg is fertilized, it can't implant into the uterine wall, and that prevents conception. So it's an effective contraceptive without many side effects. The one side effect is if you overdose it, it causes permanent sterility, both men and women. And if you overdose it, it will cause an abortion. So the Crow name for this plant, I don't know the Shoshone name for it, but the Crow name for it is Alakshabio, which means abortion plant. And by the way, Puccoon, this one is in the borage family. And the borages are selenium concentrators also. So this is buffalo berry. It's one of the most important food plants in the Shoshone tradition in Wyoming. Grows in wet spots in low areas where water table comes up high in the spring and water's just below the surface during the spring flood. The berries are delicious. They don't really fully mature until after they freeze once. So it's generally not harvested until September, mid-September. After the berries freeze, they lose a lot of their bitter taste and they become very sweet. And I have some buffalo berries right here. This is Shepherdea argentea, silver buffalo berry. I'll just give you a look at it. Now, these are 2 years old. And they still have flavor. They still have a nice kind of citrus flavor. And sweet. You have to chew on them for a while to get down to that. But when these are fresh, they're very succulent, and they are pounded into a sauce that was used a lot on buffalo meat. And that's how they have come to have the name buffalo berry. The sauce, I've had some of the sauce that was made by Alma Snell, who was a traditional Crow woman who was a great cook also. And she made some dry buffalo meat, which is very dry, and you need a sauce to eat it, really. And that's how we ate it. It was pulverized dry buffalo meat with buffalo berry sauce, which looks like ketchup when it's prepared. It's got a thickener in it. I'm not sure what she used as a thickener. Could have been fireweed pith or a number of other plants like bitterroot that were used as thickeners. But it was delicious. It was not necessarily sweet, a sweet aftertaste, but it was more like a meat sauce. Like a barbecue sauce without quite so much sugar in it. So these are very, very tasty berries, but you have to wait till after they freeze, which is true of a lot of berries. Not all of them, but many of them. They develop more of the sugar content after they freeze. So these bushes can grow up to 20 feet tall. They're usually about 8 to 10 feet tall. But if you're in a very protected place with a lot of groundwater, they can grow taller than that. And they are very prolific producers of berries, as you can see in this picture. The leaves are kind of a sagebrush green color. So this is Melanie Smokey, a western Shoshone woman collecting buffalo berries down around Lander. Buffalo berries grow real well along rivers. And this is along the North Fork of the Paposia River, where on a good year, the trees are just loaded and heavy with berries. But right alongside the buffalo berries is another very important plant. Two important plants. One of them is chokecherry, and the other one is a look-alike. It looks a lot like chokecherry, and it's in the same family, the rose family. But it's called Hawthorn, and it has bigger berries that don't taste as good as the chokecherries. Well, that's Hawthorn. So this must be chokecherry. It's hard to see, so I'm not positive in this photograph. They look very similar. The difference is the hawthorn has very sharp thorns on the branches that are about 1 inch to 2 inches long, and incredibly sharp, so the thorns were used for sewing awls to poke holes in leather. What I can say about chokecherry, I don't think I have any here, is chokecherry was a mainstay of the Shoshone people in Wyoming, the eastern Shoshone. It grows in the canyons, it grows along rivers. It is a heavy producer of berries that are rich in vitamin C and a class of flavonoids called proanthocyanidins. These are the best antioxidants for maintaining cardiovascular health. So it's a nutrient that is only now being recognized in the last 20 years or so as so important that is probably the absence of this in the American diet that accounts for such a high cardiovascular disease rate in civilized countries, especially the United States. This was in the diet, in the Shoshone diet, almost every day because they were collected in the summer and then mashed, broken down with a rock monometate style until it was a mash, and then it was formed into palm-sized patties. And these patties could be dried in the sun. They were dried in the sun, and then they would preserve that way for years. When you were ready to use them, you could break them apart into water, into boiling water, and use them to cook with. You could remanufacture them into a Shoshone pudding. I've been told it's called goat soup, which is delicious. You could add a sweetener to that and make it into a dessert-type pudding. Of course, the Shoshones here had Rocky Mountain maple growing in the really deep canyons, which could be broken off in the spring, and you could collect maple syrup from the branches in pouches in the spring of the year when the daytime temperature is above freezing and the nighttime temperature is below freezing. Which is right about now, about end of March, beginning of April, when that sap was collected. And it was the same thing as maple syrup, except it probably wasn't boiled down. It was just kept as a syrup, as a thin syrup. Very sweet, as a source of sugar. Box elder was used further east in eastern Wyoming because it is in the maple family and it also produces maple syrup. So the Crows used box elder syrup, and they used it along with chokecherries to make their chokecherry pudding. Chokecherries also have a seed. When I said they crush the berries with rocks. They spent a lot of time doing that to break down the seed pit inside so that it was a fine grit, and then you could eat it. And that was critically important because the nutrition inside the pit is different from the outside of the flesh of the berry. So the berry itself was good for cardiovascular health. The contents of the pit was high in nitriliside, which is a cyanide sugar, which is a cancer preventive drug. It's controversial, some people don't believe that, but a recent study was done that showed that if the traditional chokecherry pudding was made in the traditional way with the seeds incorporated into the flesh of the berry under clinical biomedical research studies, it improved all the indicators of cardiovascular health and impeded tumor growth. So this was only done last year by a Paiute Shoshone woman named Destiny Sky Pete. And I think she's in pre-med now. But she was a student who wanted to show that the traditional diet actually was healthy. And she started with chokecherry, which was in the diet almost every day because the berries are prolific and they could be preserved very well by pounding and then made into patties for future use. The chokecherry bark was also harvested for a cough medicine and a cold medicine. So if you had a sore throat or a cough, you made a tea out of the inner bark of the chokecherry. So if you take the chokecherry bark and slice it off with a knife and wiggle it, you can eventually separate the inner bark, which is light green color, from the outer bark, which is dark red, and get a tea from that that tastes just like bitter almonds. It's a very nice taste, makes a wonderful tea. It's relaxing, it's good to drink before bedtime, and it soothes the sore throat. That inner bark was also put on skin cancers, and it reduces the size of the tumors until they disappear. I've seen this happen, so I know it works. That's chokecherry. Hawthorn berries are different. They're bigger. I have some here, and you can see what they look like. They're black hawthorn is a dark purple color, and such a dark purple that it looks black while they're on the tree, but they're actually purple. Purple is the color of OPC, which is a very powerful antioxidant that's been studied in modern times. Those are the dried berries. If you make a tincture out of it, which you can do with alcohol or glycerin, this is the tincture. The liquid turns red or purple, and the berries become colorless. They turn brown. I'll put that right here. The berries lose their color because the alcohol is a solvent for OPC, which stands for oligomeric proanthocyanidin, which is one of the most potent antioxidants known to modern medicine. It's used to treat conditions of the eye, where you have things like macular degeneration, which is a weakness of the blood vessels feeding the retina. It's used for leaky veins, they call it, where your veins lose their muscular integrity and fluid emerges from the capillaries. And it's used to treat lipid peroxidation of the intima layer of the blood vessels, which is the interior lining. And that's where cancers start. That's where plaque starts that causes atherosclerosis. and it's one of the primary indicators of cardiovascular disease. This treats that. OPC is an antioxidant that reforms the plaque, the damaged interior of the blood vessels, and thereby lowers cholesterol. And if in older people where the blood pressure slowly starts going up along with cholesterol levels, it lowers both the blood pressure and the cholesterol because it's treating the cause of those two things, which is damage to the intima layer of the arteries and veins, and restores the flexibility of the blood vessels. So Hawthorn is actually a more intense treatment for old age-related cardiovascular symptoms than chokecherry. Chokecherry is in the daily diet, so it's good that way if it's still in the diet on a daily basis, which in traditional Shoshone culture it pretty much was. Hawthorn, on the other hand, treats an ongoing illness that we today would call cardiovascular disease or even heart failure related to cardiovascular disease. So this is a very important discovery, fairly recent in modern medicine, but thousands of years old in traditional Shoshone culture. The Crows considered hawthorn to be a very important plant, medicinal plant, so much so that they had a hawthorn ceremony, which was a dance similar to the chokecherry ceremony that the Shoshones do, where women would, before collecting hawthorn berries, would go out and the first tree they collected from, they would do this ceremonial dance and offer the tree beautiful moccasins that were made for that tree. They did that and sang a song of praise for the hawthorn, and I think that's probably because it was an old people's medicine, kept the old people around to tell stories and to educate the young people. Because in the old days, the old people were revered and respected. I have a hawthorn branch here just to show you why it's called hawthorn, for one thing. The berries are called haws, but I don't know if this is something the camera is going to catch, but these sharp thorns are so sharp you just barely need to touch one and it'll penetrate the surface of your skin and draw blood. And that's why it's really hard to collect hawthorn berries. You have to pay attention, you have to have good eyesight, and you have to be careful with where you put your hands. These trees are often eradicated in agricultural areas where you have livestock because they can run through a patch of hawthorn, and often hawthorn will grow in thickets. And if an animal runs through it as frightened from a predator, it can poke its eyes out. So a lot of these plants were bulldozed out of agricultural areas where they could be very thick along rivers. But black hawthorn is one species of about 7 or 8 that I know of hawthorns. But it's the black hawthorn that's the most potent source of OPC, this very potent antioxidant. It's very healthy for you. So this is a black hawthorn thorn. There's red hawthorns, river hawthorns, a bunch of different hawthorns that have different size thorns on them. This one is especially good for making awls to puncture thick leather, like elk neck leather for sewing. So these were collected and made into tools by women for sewing leather. The bark on hawthorn is just like the bark on chokecherry because they're close relatives, and it can be sheared off the inner bark, made into a tea for sore throat and colds. By the way, hawthorn is sold today. It's becoming more and more popular as a treatment for high blood pressure, for people who do not want to go on some of the cholesterol-lowering drugs and ACE inhibitor drugs that have side effects for lowering blood pressure. And I have known quite a few people who have used it very successfully to control blood pressure and cholesterol levels. So here is a picture of the hawthorn berries with the hawthorn leaf. Hawthorn leaf is serrated along the edge, and the serrations get deeper toward the tip of the leaf. So that's one way to identify it. Chokecherries, which can look very much like this, don't have those deep serrations along the margin of the leaf. The hawthorn is in the genus Crataegus, and the black hawthorn is Crataegus douglasii. And the chokecherries are in the genus Prunus, and they are Prunus virginiana. The chokecherries grow from the west coast all the way to the east coast. Hawthorn is more isolated to regions within the United States. So we move on. We're still in the river areas along the foothills. And one of the trees that grows there is the cottonwood. We have two species of cottonwood that are common here, the Populus deltoides, which is this one, which has another name now too, but deltoides is still in the books, and black cottonwood, and the narrow-leaf cottonwood that grows generally in higher elevations in the mountains. So here in Atlantic City at 7,500 feet, we only have the narrow-leaf cottonwood because of the elevation here. But at lower elevations, down around Lander and the foothills, in wet places, floodplains, you have this black cottonwood. It has a distinctive leaf pattern there. You can see it's kind of heart-shaped. Both these cottonwoods have a sap that was used to heal broken skin. Mostly the dry skin that cracks in the winter and forms these really hard edges along the crack, and it bleeds whenever you try to move it. To tenderize that kind of skin and make it heal over, the sap from the bark along the branches of this cottonwood and the high elevation cottonwood, but mostly this one, was used as a salve mixed with buffalo back fat. And it could be kept for a long time because buffalo back fat is a preservative. It's not like the other fat in the body. That fat actually prevents oxidation for a long time, so it's good to make salves out of. The fat itself is soothing, and you add the sap from cottonwood to it, and it's healing. It increases the rate of healing. Also in the bark of cottonwood, you have salicylates, what is called salicylic acid, which is the basis of aspirin. And that's true of any of the plants in this entire family, which is called the Salicaceae family or the willow family. So willows, cottonwoods, aspens, and poplars were all used the same way to treat headaches and generalized pain, even some specific pains, just the way we use aspirin. So it reduced fevers, it was anti-inflammatory. You could use it to help with toothaches, especially if you use it with things you can put in your mouth that actually take the pain away, like osha root or echinacea root. Those actually kill the pain locally. This is more of a systemic pain reliever through the blood. And it's true of the willows and the aspens also. And when you planned ahead, it was traditional to gather these buds right here. You can see the buds at the top of this branch. Can you see that? These buds, before they open up into leaves, are loaded with salicins, the compound that is similar to aspirin. In fact, the first aspirin tablet was called powders of white willow in the 1790 Pharmacopoeia of London, and it was made from willow buds that are just like this, very concentrated salicylic acid. So it was the anti-inflammatory for headaches, nausea, generalized pain. And these buds were collected and preserved in buffalo back fat. And you could take them out of the back fat, or you could mash them into the fat for topical use, and you'd have a salve. Otherwise, you would chew on these buds, and it would be like chewing on an aspirin tablet. Let's see. Cottonwood had a few other uses. There's the leaf of this cottonwood. But the trunk of a cottonwood tends to hollow out in the middle as it gets very old and big. The center part of the trunk will rot out, and you can take these trunks and hollow them out manually to the right thickness, to the outside edge of the trunk. And this was how drums were made. So this drum is being made with a soft hide and a cottonwood trunk that had been hollowed out to exactly the right thickness to have this proper sound. And then everything is shrunk. The wood shrinks as the leather hide shrinks on the top of it as it dries. And if you know what you're doing, and you've done this before, there's a traditional way to do it where it keeps itself together. It tightens itself up as everything shrinks. And makes for a very tight drum with just the right sound. And then you tune it up by adjusting these straps on the side that are made of the same hide. So there are deerskin drums and buffalo hide drums. This is Tom Lucas building this drum, who studied a lot of native crafts and learned how to do these things, grew up on the Crow Reservation in Montana. And this made a very nice drum with a beautiful sound to it. So now we're moving up an elevation out of foothills into the mountains, and this is going to be the montane zone where we have some new trees and some new understory plants to look at.